Our next session will be led by the Netherlands Red Cross and their guests. Humanitarian agencies, development banking, and nature conservation have traditionally been independent in their efforts to bring a positive change to the world. Often active in their same landscapes, they tend to stick to their own expertise and ways of working. But at a time when climate change is simultaneously affecting communities, economies, and ecosystems, bubbles need to be burst. In this session, representatives from the IUCN, FMO, the Dutch Development Bank, and the Netherlands Red Cross have a frank conversation. What is holding them back from working together? What are the core challenges when they do collaborate? And how can we reframe the relationships? The moderator for this session will be Alberta Opoku, Senior Press Officer at the Netherlands Red Cross. She will be joined by Charles KARANGWA, Head of Forests, Landscapes and Livelihoods for Africa at the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN. They will also be joined by Wendelin van der Veld, Business Developer at the Netherlands Red Cross, and Iwan Meister, Advisor to the Dutch Development Bank, FMO, and to the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development, the DFCD. Alberta, the floor is back to you.
Thank you, Pablo. And a very good morning indeed to everyone, and a very warm welcome to Busting Silos, Embracing Landscapes, where we hope indeed to take you on a journey through the challenges and benefits of the landscape approach when it comes to nature conservation. Well, Pablo already introduced me. I'm the Senior Spokesperson and Media Relations Officer from the Netherlands Red Cross. To give you a short overview of what you can expect in this session, we will start with a brief introduction of the speakers, followed by a poll to find out a little bit more about you, our viewers. After that, the speakers will shortly introduce themselves and their work, and then we'll have a discussion with the 4 panel members. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, 4 panel members, because the 4th panel member is you. We invite you to actively take part in the discussion and to share your thoughts and questions with us through the chat function. My colleague, Raymond Duijsens, whom you cannot see, is behind the scenes Before we get to hear from our speakers, let's find out a little more about you. Can we have our first poll, please? So the question in this poll is, which sector do you currently work in? Which sector do you currently work in? Is it humanitarian, development, nature conservation, or otherwise? And if it is otherwise, please state in the chat which sector you represent. I can't see the results as yet, but I'm sure Raymond is working hard on that. So which sector do you currently work in? Humanitarian, development, nature conservation, or otherwise? There's no, I'm not getting any input here. Okay, well then we'll just move on to our next question. How familiar are you with the landscape approach? Can we have the second poll? Thank you. How familiar are you with the landscape approach? Is it completely alien? Have you heard of it, and are you considering to use it in your work? Are you already applying it? Or do you live and breathe landscapes? Wow, the input that I'm getting is that everybody is already using it and applying it. Well, that's great to know. No pressure on the panel members. You find yourselves amongst an expert audience here. It's great to see that's the input that we're having. Now, to make sure that we're all on the same page here as regards to the definitions of landscape approach, I'd like to show you or tell you our understanding of the landscape approach. It is the sustainable management of large areas that share similar or interrelated ecological processes. It takes into consideration the full socioeconomic context, whereby the interests of different stakeholders are assessed in an integral manner and aligned through dialogue. In short, our view of the landscape approach is that it is flexible, it has a long-term perspective, and it is holistic. Now, without further delay, let me introduce you to our first speaker, Charles KARANGWA, from the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Charles?
Thank you. Thank you, Alberta, for the great opportunity to speak this morning to the audience. And I have to mention that discussing the landscape approach and of course, talking to experts, as you rightly mentioned, that everyone seems to be already using or applying landscape approach is great. But I want to highlight a couple of things as we try to get to this conversation. I don't know, Alberta, do you want me to go ahead with the points now, or you just want me to introduce myself? Thank you. Next point. Can you move the slides, please? Just put the whole slides. I just wanted to highlight that landscape restoration is one of the concepts that is used to bring stakeholders together. And this varies from global, national, and subnational responses. Still, and the current situation is that, of course, it tends to lock into one single land use or encourage or prevent single action. You will hear people focusing on avoiding deforestation. Others are just decided to improve agricultural productivity. Others are looking at halting desertification, and this includes even the three conventions that we are talking about from the United Nations. You have a convention on combating desertification, a convention on biodiversity, a convention on climate change, and all of this operates in the landscapes. And of course, the challenge is that the ambition to implement large-scale landscape restoration efforts cannot be achieved through one set of interventions or just by changing the condition within a single land use. Next, please. I just want to give an example of how landscape approach is very critical. This is an analysis IUCN implemented in the Rwandan landscape restoration assessment opportunity, where you have a national strategic poverty reduction strategy, which focuses on improving and increasing forest cover. You have electricity access to 70% by 2020, which is already passed. You have 100% access to clean water, and you have agricultural production to 2,600 kilocalories per day for the population. Under that, you have the underlying aspects of the economic development, which is reducing poverty and increased per GDP capital, GDP per capita up to 1,240. These are the government ambitions. But how can landscape restoration be used to deliver that? And within the landscape approach, you have institutions that are in charge of water resource management. You have institutions that are in charge of agriculture. You have the forest department. You have the finance ministry. And all of this, of course, creates different benefits to communities. And should these institutions work together, landscape restoration can deliver actually all the above goals. For example, increasing forest cover. If you invest in soil erosion control, you improve agricultural productivity, which is about food. You improve water security as well. but also you improve energy through electricity by improving hydro power electricity generation. Next, please. And there are many benefits when you apply landscape approach within a particular landscape. And in this context, you are looking at landscape restoration benefits. You are actually delivering multiple services. I mentioned earlier, not only forest, but also sustainably managed forest, agroforestry, climate-smart agriculture, and others. But all of this together in one landscape can generate, of course, access to water, fresh air, biodiversity, contribute to climate mitigation through carbon sequestration, but also health medicines. And in terms of supply chains as well, you are creating a resilient supply chain, resilient investments. You are also improving, of course, climate risk for investors, as well as disaster risk reduction. So it's really a way in that one approach to deliver multiple benefits to hundreds of people. There are many benefits to this, and I will go to the next slide, where I now really share monetized values and benefits and potential for this. The whole global world has committed through the UN forest to restore 350 million hectares. And this has even increased with the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration to be more ambitious to deliver 1 billion hectares under restoration by 2030. But the 350 million bond challenge and United Nations forest commitments itself generates more than 84 billion per year in net benefits, sequester an addition of 1 gigatons of carbon per year, but also reduce the current emission gaps between 11 to 17%, as well as increasing yields by 30% for 50 million hectares. And I wanted to end my talk here by saying that by embracing landscape approach, you are saving significant resources through coordination, through joint working together, but also, of course, more impact and more people are impacted positively by different interventions instead of working in silos. Let me stop from there, and I'm happy to talk to questions from the audience. Over.
Well, thank you. Thank you. In landscape restoration. I'd like to move on to the second speaker, minding the time, of course. Welcome, Iwan Meister from the Dutch Entrepreneurial Development Bank, FMO, and the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development. Iwan, please take it away.
Thank you, Alberta, and thank you, EDD, for having me here today. And I will try to keep it short, speak a bit faster, but let me start with introducing myself. So my name is Iwan Meister. I have a background in private equity in emerging markets. If you go to the next slide, I'm not so confronted with my aging. I currently sit in a few boards and help companies that want to invest or move into emerging markets. But my main responsibility at the moment is helping FMO with the management of the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development. Next slide, please. For those who don't know FMO, FMO is the Dutch Development Bank with a portfolio of over 10 billion euros spread over the emerging markets. And there's a bit of a bias towards Africa and Asia, but it's quite spread. The head office is in The Hague, but we have a few local offices as well. Next slide, please. As mentioned, one of the funds that FMO is managing is the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development, the DFCD. The DFCD is a 160 million euro fund that can invest in anything that's climate related with a special focus on climate adaptation, but we can also do climate mitigation. But talking about busting silos, we don't manage this alone. We manage this together with CFM, SNV, and WWF. And together we have this whole scala of expertise and knowledge. From us, FMO and CFM really on the investment side, but SNV and WWF bring a lot of experience and expertise in humanitarian, conservation, environment, and the social angle. Next slide, please. And the cool thing is, by working together, we can do projects and investments that other investors would normally shy away from, and we in the past would also shy away from. So if we see a project that's earlier stage than we would normally do, or too greenfield or too risky, we can, together with SMV and WWF, see how can we bring this project to the next level. We have grants available for that, or SMV and WWF have grants available for that. And of course, they have a lot of experience and knowledge to do this. And once it reaches a level that we can invest in, we also try and see if we can bring in private capital. We often do this through a blended finance structure, so they come in at the same time as us. We try to structure it in a way that they also come in, or can come in. And if it's too risky still, we can do it first, and then in 1 or 2 years, we can attract private capital. So the cool thing is, we can do projects that would otherwise not be done, even with private capital. Next slide, please. And we don't just do this one there, one there, one there. We really have a landscape approach. So we really try to see, how can we bring this landscape to the next level? How can we increase people's income? How can we balance biodiversity and economic growth? How can we make the people living there more resilient to climate disasters and the climate change? And I think I've been over my time already, but looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have today. Back to you, Alberta.
No, that was perfectly fine, Iwan. Thank you very much for that impressive presentation. Again, just like Charles's. No pressure here, Wendelin. Wendelin van der Veld from the Netherlands Red Cross and Princess Margriet Fund. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alberta. And just a small note for everyone who is seeing us. The reason why this specific group is together is not because there was a very impressive conference being organized now, but really because this conversation has started already in the past 2 years, at least since the time I joined this team. So, and this is also an open invitation to everyone to engage with us. So I'm very happy with the expert panel, but also the non-expert panel, but definitely your ideas are also very much welcome and give us new angles. Going to my presentation. So the next slide, please. Also don't want the picture. So the Netherlands Red Cross Princess Margriet Fund has been set up in 2014. It's pretty recent, but we had a very explicit mission to focus on prevention. And now you can ask, well, why is that so special? For one, it is less than 1% of humanitarian funding worldwide goes to prevention, and the Netherlands Red Cross felt compelled to give it that focus. However, we want to do it differently. So we really want to try to find new innovative ways of having more efficient and effective humanitarian assistance. And with that, you do it with partnerships. Hence, we are sitting here together. New methodologies, new tools, and new approaches. Next slide, please. So the Red Cross resilience approach, which is a bit our north in the sense how we approach prevention, sees risks for communities not only as within or near them, but also on a wider geographical scale. So you should, and that you can already see where I'm heading to. So that's the landscape approach, where you see the ecosystem. And that ecosystem can magnify or mitigate risks, as Charles has already mentioned. These two projects, very briefly, in Haiti, you can think we have, it's a very mountainous country. So when there are eroded hill slopes and there are torrential rains, that combination leads to landslides and floods. The same thing for, well, in the Philippines, we have a coastal protection program using a landscape approach, where especially mangroves get our dear attention as a first line of defense of coastal ecosystems. Now, one very, very, very important thing here is that, yes, it's partnerships amongst different knowledge fields as FMO, as FMO DFCD, as with IUCN and the Red Cross, but it's also with the local stakeholders. So communities and local authorities must be involved, not the least because at one point you will want to start up new programs, and the lasting impact will only happen if they are the full owners and stewards of their landscape. Next slide, please. So this is a very brief snapshot of our global presence, and it's also an invitation to connect with us should you have exciting propositions or insights, or even connecting to landscapes that we have active, and how can we maximize our impact. Next slide, please. So I wanted to finish again with one of the local stakeholders that make basically everything happen. We have a bit of a social contract to operate, right? We do things that they want us to do and need us to do. And we bring in the knowledge and expertise to put the landscape to a next level, to borrow the words from Iwan. So this lady here on your left-hand side is Charlene Léger, mother of 4, Haitian. She runs her own good-selling business, and she is the queen of this nursery. So you see her holding these 2 nursery plants, and she's quite a commanding and impressive force of nature. And I end with saying, it's with and for them and for these communities that organizations such as FMO, IUCN, and the Netherlands Red Cross are able to put their full value at the service of landscape restoration. Thank you. Over to you, Alberta.
Thank you. Thank all 3 of you for those impressive introductions. I look forward to the panel discussion, but before that, I'd like to remind the audience that we encourage you, ladies and gentlemen, to actively take part in the discussion. So if you have any questions or any remarks or any contribution whatsoever, please state that in the chat and we will get back to you. So that was for starters. Getting back to your introductions, landscape approach is a great method when you are working on landscape restoration, on preservation, and on prevention. So what seems to be the problem within your respective sectors when it comes to working in silos and busting silos?
Would you like to?
Yeah, thank you.
Gwendoline.
No. Charles, go ahead. Charles, go ahead, please.
No, I had struggled to hear Alberta in the beginning, so you can start, Gwendoline, and then I will come in.
This is true love. No. Well, so for one, I think it's a bit of a broad, I think it might be a common challenge with different organizations, is with anything that is new and that challenges the way of doing things, like innovation, there is resistance to change. That is not saying an organization is better or worse, it's just as how we humans are mostly, and also in our organizational ways. So that is one, and then we need to open up and be comfortable with uncertainty, and also with the testing and iteration of new solutions. So landscape approach is a learning journey and not a business plan that has set rules that will be with milestones that will be delivered and with certainties. And this of course has spin-offs with the funding cycles, which are 5 years, whilst we want to set up landscape restoration programs of 20. And it demands a lot of change in thinking, internal, but also external. So a second last point I would like to mention is the recombination of knowledge fields. So by acknowledging that we don't know certain things, and we go looking for external partners into our organizations, we will be able to create more value. Sometimes, and I must say, so the Red Cross has a wealth of knowledge and expertise, and we are at times maybe too big to be able also to be challenged and look outside. It happens a lot already, and but we must keep paying attention to that to be senior and be strict also on our points of improvement. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you. I like the question, and I want to approach it from a challenge and opportunity point of view. Of course, we talked about landscape approach with the potential of generating impact, transformation. And this transformation is the core from why we want really to push and invest significantly in the landscape approach. One of the lessons I learned throughout my career is that there's quite a lot of loss in resources when people don't work together. I remember working on a project in Niger, in West Africa, in 2012, and because several partners, development NGOs and Humanitarian, were all looking at where do we fit within these districts or local community, I realized how much actually people living very far from the road could not actually be reached simply because no one was willing to go there. And everyone was really trying to fight in the same location. And I remember having more than 12 to 13 NGOs all working in the same sector, where there are almost 12 sectors that are really unreached. And we lost quite a lot until people decided to come together. Let's talk to each other, let's coordinate, let's see how do we respond together to the needs. And we managed to save quite a number of investments there. The second is landscape. When people start working together, it brings a lot of opportunities of delivering and sharing the vision and really impacting communities. I have several case studies where I saw joint organizations efforts really helping people to live out of poverty and restoring nature, restoring water sources, restoring biodiversity, simply because they decided to work together. And it's intentional. It has to be intentional, and there are quite a lot of challenges, including fighting over resources. I have to mention this. There's limited resources, and then by people really failing to look at the same direction, there's all those each pulling into his own way. But as Wenlin said, I think we need to sit together on the table and encourage that cross-sectoral thinking if we want to deliver this impact at landscape scale. Thank you.
Great, Charles. Thank you. I was just wondering, because it's an invitation to everyone to join forces. Let's sit together at the table. I'm wondering, how do you ensure that you all speak the same language, coming from such different sectors, from such different, worlds or universes, so to speak? How do you ensure that you're all on the same page? Iwan?
Yeah, so we have that in our current setting, and I have to say, when this fund was just raised, the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development, we thought we were all special. We were in a pink cloud, and then when the pink cloud moves away, it's the same as in a mirage. You start thinking, but what does he really mean when he says long term or short term or big investment or small investment? And I think it's just very important to make very concrete decisions and agreements very early stage when you start a cooperation, also in long-term and short-term views, because let's be honest, in the end, if you're in conservation, humanitarian, or an investment, at one moment you want to start fundraising again, or you need additional capital, the same as we will start fundraising again soon. So it's important to agree, for example, on something like that as well, very early on, because that influences the projects you're going to take, right? Because are you going to take a project that only shows impact in 20 years, or you're going to do a project that shows impact in 3 years? You can do both, but you at least need one project as an example if you want to fundraise again. And I think in general, those agreements are very important. For example, a very high impact investment that has a high chance of no success, or a project with slightly less positive impact but a higher chance of success, the different institutions might have different preferences. As an investor, you prefer a higher chance of getting your money back, while maybe as another entity, you might want to focus on, okay, let's go for the highest chance of success for impact. So I think those agreements need to be made very early on, so that you don't get frustration in the process.
How do you ensure that you speak the same language and you're on the same page?
Is that to me again?
No, Charles.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I think it's not a magic bullet points, Alberta. I guess whatever. One of the mistakes traditionally that development partners and other institutions have made in the past, which is being corrected, is that we do think we have a response for every question for a country. We tend to bring it from a suitcase. And I think that's a very old school. Common language speaks to the national strategies, the vision of a country, the community needs. If you all look into that, then you have the common vision. You speak the same language. And then how do you address those problems together? That's the first scenario. The second, I think, is also how we admit that we don't know everything as partners, as international organization, as investors. We need to recognize that communities are the owners of the problems and the solutions. If you bring the solution without them, you are talking to yourself at the end of the day, and you of course have a very good project implemented, but whenever you leave the landscape, you will live with your impact, and there's no sustainability there. So the common language, number one, how do we speak to the government, the national priorities and the vision of a country, the needs for the community, and then at the second level, how do we actually make communities partners than beneficiaries? Because they are bringing their force, they are bringing their knowledge. And by recognizing that, you are actually speaking to their needs at heart. Then you are addressing and they own whatever contribution, technical contribution, financial contribution we are bringing. So that's, I guess, sitting around the table, having all the common vision around fixing a problem helps a lot, speaking the same language, Alberta. Back to you.
And having an open mind to everyone, basically. There is a question from the audience, and I'd like to ask you, Wendelin, to have a look at it. The question is, what policies are needed to enable these approaches to be replaced and scaled?
Wow, that's a hard one. I will definitely need Charles and Iwan's help, but I will speak from my humble experience. So again, I recognize the knowledgeability of my audience. So in terms of policy, so there are a few that are, as we like to say, theories of change, right? What is within your control? What is within your influence and concern that affects your project? There is one that has come back over and over again, and that is regulatory stability, and including, for instance, items as land ownership. So I will give an example from Haiti, where there's actually a huge World Bank program working on it as we speak, to bring clarity to land ownership, right? Where you need to know before to make an investment. People will hardly invest in country if it's a bank, if it's individuals, communities, if it can be taken away from you or if it's unclear. So that's an example of something that is probably beyond the scope of what we as Netherlands Red Cross do. In terms of policies, I do see a lot of needed for policy alignment. So, and maybe I'm not absolutely sure if I'm addressing very correctly the question, the audience will tell me, but for example, the economic empowerment, that is something that is a request that comes from communities, as Charles also already was mentioning. But in order to empower communities on an economic level, and for a humanitarian organization to contribute to that, together with a nature conservation organization and a bank, we are all asked to step a bit outside of our comfort zone. So for the Red Cross, for example, we would be looking at what are the impact value chains that you have locally that can bring more benefits to the local environment. And then with that, what are the influential policies, legislation? There's another dimension of so I will speak for the work that the Red Cross does, and it also impacts the landscapes, is the close relation that we have as an auxiliary entity to governments. That basically means that we are obliged by law to support governments in their disaster prevention, relief, and response efforts. And so we will definitely look and try to advocate for better policies and measures. However, there is a balance to it too. I do think that there are three dimensions which need solid.
I'll have to ask you to be brief, Wendelin.
Sorry. Last point. Three dimensions: for the healthy landscapes, resilient communities, and economic empowerment. These policies need to be connected, and that goes back to the point of Charles of having different institutions working on them.
Do you have anything to add, Charles, to the policies needed?
Yeah, I think we don't need a policy for people to work together. We need just a common vision of focusing. And there are multiple policies. I mean, if you take an example of a country, you have hundreds of those policies. but how those policies are implemented, they support a vision of a community, a vision of a nation. And as development partners, as investors, how do we manage to support delivering that vision? And therefore, I think Alberta, and probably the audience will agree, I hope so, you can also disagree with me, there's no one single policy that can pull people to work together, but more or less, how do we define common interest in addressing multiple challenges at landscape level? That's actually policy. A landscape approach is not a written policy, but it's a practice that would solve the issues of silos across the development sector.
You share that view, Iwan?
On private entities in general. But of course, we choose our landscapes also based on the policies and regulations there. And then one example is there's a few countries where it's very difficult once you make an investment to also get your money out of the country due to regulations and exchange rate rules, etc. So those policies are very important. And what I want to add is that for us, a landscape approach is also sort of an efficiency, right? Because we may not always understand the policies, or because we work in so many countries, and we really want to understand and work with the regulators, for example. So by choosing certain landscapes, we can really focus and work more efficiently to really understand the local regulations, local policies. But of course, if you work too much in one country and in one landscape, it also comes with risk. So from an investor perspective, you don't want all your eggs in one basket. If there's a drought, or if there's a flooding, or another climate-related risk, or non-climate-related risk, you can all your money can be gone. So it's a slightly different angle on the policy aspect, but so by working with a landscape approach, we can really try to work with the policy and regulation makers.
Thank you. And thank you, Andrea Athanas, for posing that question. Andrea also shares, she's from the African Wildlife Foundation, by the way. She's also posted a link about work with IUCN and SNV about leveraging finance for delivering integrated solutions for conservation and development. We'll make sure that we share that link also with everybody else. So thank you, Andreas, and thank you, our panel members. Playing the devil's advocate here, it's good that you're all, working across sectors and busting silos and everything. In Holland, we like to say that the one with the money always calls the shots. So aren't you guys afraid that one sector, in this case, the finance sector, might dominate the other stakeholders? Wendelin, I'm curious to find out your views on that. Are you afraid that, Iwan or someone from the finance sector might dominate the humanitarian and conservation ambitions that the project requires?
Nice devil's advocate, Alberta. That's why you didn't want to tell us the questions beforehand. So I will be upfront. I used to work at FMO, so I have a little familiarity. If you would have asked this question 20 years ago, I would be more afraid of that. I do think, though, that today, the one with the money, in your words, does have other pressures besides the ones exerted by a nature conservation organization or a humanitarian organization to be more proactive in addressing issues as climate change, for example, or human rights situations. You have seen serious economic repercussions in value chains of, for instance, clothing retailers that have had mishaps in terms of child labor, etc. You also see but even the organizations themselves, they don't need, I will give you a very specific example. In Beira, Mozambique, there was one client of FMO that was quite hardly affected by the flooding. And there, the FMO reached out to the Red Cross, and what could we do together? At the time, we were both not ready to engage on a bigger scale because the Red Cross was busy with response, and FMO didn't have the processes in place to channel funding for relief efforts. But I think there are other outside pressures that are already guiding into the right direction. One big challenge, and that is the one that I'm very, very curious about, it's always about also the risk and equations of return on investment. So all of us, all the three of us do risk assessments. So is it risky? Is it what return do we get by investing in a landscape approach in certain regions? So that's one. We need to align those incentives. The second one is monetization of ecosystem services. That is something that has been largely outside any equation on a lot of the investment decision making. So how much is it worth to have clean air? How much is it worth to have clean water? And you can, for instance, the insurance industry is already developing insurance-related products to mangroves. We, as Red Cross, are setting up at this moment, we're trying to, don't pin me on that one, we're trying to set up a fund, an insurance facility for mangrove restoration and maintenance in the Philippines. So things are coming together, of course, not fast enough, but if we could also include the monetization of ecosystem services into the equation, that would help. And not only the one with the money calls the shots.
How do you view that, Iwan? Do you experience any, mistrust or something like that from other stakeholders because you're the one with the big bucks? Very briefly.
Well, I'm not sure in our case that we are the ones with the big bucks, but in the case of the DFCD, I think we really need each other. We couldn't do the projects without our partners SNV and CFM and WWF. So I think we really need each other. Yes, what I mentioned earlier as well, we might have differences in decision making, and then future fundraising might play a role in that decision making. Because the more fund, if you can prove success and the more funding you attract on a later stage, the more impact you can have. And I think it's also really the case of working together to see how that works. And in our case, SNV and WWF have so much local presence that, yeah, we couldn't work without them on these difficult projects. I mean, I have experiences of trying to do it from The Hague, a difficult project somewhere in Africa or Asia. You just need eyes and ears on the ground and knowledge on the ground, and people really understanding what the needs and possibilities of the local people are.
Yeah. Okay. And Charles, a question for you from the audience. If you work on a humanitarian or development project following the landscape approach, how do you ensure that stakeholders that you brought together still cooperate even after the project has already ended?
Thank you, Alberta. I just wanted to say that the first question is very critical. Of course, money talks, that we say, but I think history has shown that having money does not solve the problem unless you consider the context where you are investing. And the context means people, means nature, means landscape, means ecosystem services, means all those dynamics that actually help the investment to thrive. So therefore, I think from development point of view, as a development professional and conservation professional, I think it's very time now for investors actually to rethink the investment models, because we have seen many projects. I have worked on a project in a country, which I want to mention, where an investor came in thinking that is going to build a very huge hydropower plant to generate megawatts of electricity. But he just forgot that upstream there was a very huge population living there and who were degrading the entire landscape every time. And you can't believe, after building siltation, sedimentation in water, flooding, and just killed the whole investments, and nearly $5 million was lost because he couldn't actually run electricity with that whole big sediment. And then the model changed. He started consulting communities, and I think that's where I see the investment going. Now, for the question of how do we link the landscape approach with the humanitarian work, I guess it's actually the best way to do. Humanitarian comes in to solve a problem that is there. But we do not bring a solution unless we consult, engage, consider the knowledge of communities in place. I've worked in a humanitarian context in Niger. I can give an example where we were fighting with a hunger issues, because in Niger, it's a Sahel country. You have a hunger gap where people spend nearly 4 or 5 months without harvest. Now, how do you address that problem? At the same time, you are addressing issues related to the cause of the hunger gap. So we were restoring nature using food for work, cash for work, and we saw tremendous change. I personally led a project that worked on 128,000 hectares within a lifespan of 2 or 3 years. And we managed to bring that whole total landscape into under restoration, because we are fixing a humanitarian problem. Communities knows that the issue is because of degradation, and they are investing that while, of course, benefiting from that humanitarian aid and investments. So I think the landscape approach still is very important, and how you bring communities on the table to sustain what they are doing for them, for their resilience, is very critical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm being mindful of the time here, and I cannot even believe that we're almost out of time, because it seems like we've just started and the discussion is has just been lit, so to speak. But we will have to be closing very soon. So I'll just ask each of you very, very shortly, just one sentence. What is the most important thing that you want our audience to take away from this session? One sentence or one word. Let's start with you, Iwan.
Maybe one sentence. It might seem complicated, but it really works. The cooperation between humanitarian, conservation, and investment, it works, and it can have so much positive impact. So please do.
Thank you. And Charles?
The one message I will give Alberta is simple. Landscape approach makes development and investments resilient and beneficial than just working in silos. So let's all of us work together. It gives more results on, what do we call it? It gives more results on investments than just working separately. Over.
Mm. And Wendelin?
This gave me time to think. Thank you, Alberta. I would say step with us in this learning journey. Join us, and we will figure it out together. Don't be intimidated by it. We're going to do it together.
Thank you.
Okay, well, that's great. Yeah. Again, a big invitation to everyone listening, and to everyone to hop on board, bust the silos, and embrace the landscape approach. I do hope that we've been able to get that message across to the viewers, and to get a sense of the enthusiasm that you guys have for the landscape approach, that we've been able to bring that across as well. Just one final thing before we go, because
sorry, Alberta. Sorry, we will have to close indeed. But really, thanks to all the session speakers. This was great, and really great messages passed across throughout the session. We have to move to a next session in 30 seconds. We heard really how importance of ownership and communities, how communities own the answers and the problems and the solutions. Thank you, Charles. Also, you certainly convinced us of the importance of achieving the 350 million hectare targets for land restoration, and many great lessons on how to work together, get external knowledge, get challenged, even when you are a very big institution with a lot of inside knowledge. We have to move to our next session now, just after the bumper.